The sun climbed lazily over the Blue Ridge Mountains, casting long golden rays over the Mitchell family farm just outside Asheville. Rows of white folding chairs lined the pasture facing a simple arbor adorned with fresh-cut wildflowers. Laura Mitchell stood beside her sister, fussing over the final place settings with the quiet precision of a woman who had spent years finding order in chaos. At 56, she was wiry and weathered her hands calloused from decades of work, but her green eyes still carried the vibrant intelligence that had once made her the best school librarian in 3 counties. Today, her only child was getting married, and Laura had ensured every detail reflected Rachel's gentle soul. The rustic ceremony was her daughter's dream, far removed from hotel ballrooms and fine crystal. It was meant to be intimate, honest, unpretentious, just like her. And yet, as Laura arranged the mason jar centerpieces one last time, she couldn't shake the gnawing unease that had settled into her gut since the night before, when an unexpected guest had pulled her aside near the porch. That guest was Henry Carter, the estranged older brother of the groom's father who had flown in from Oregon after over a decade of silence. He had waited until the rehearsal dinner wound down, then asked Laura to walk with him beneath the old maple tree near the barn. His voice was quite steady, but weighted with tension. He had said Ethan was a good man, that he had always been strong-headed but kind-hearted. Then his tone shifted. He told her something wasn't right, that the Carter family, especially Frank, had secrets buried deeper than the roots of the Appalachian pines. Laura had asked what he meant, but Henry just shook his head and said he had said too much already. Then he disappeared before sunrise, leaving no note, no number, only the echo of his warning ringing in Laura's ears. As the first guests trickled into the pasture and the scent of sweetgrass filled the air, she tried to push it from her mind. Today was Rachel's day. Her daughter looked radiant in her vintage lace dress, her auburn curls tucked beneath a veil, eyes brimming with hope. Laura held onto that image like a shield. The ceremony unfolded like a scene from a dream. The violinist played Appalachian Waltz as Rachel walked barefoot down the aisle, escorted by Laura and their family friend Dean. Ethan stood waiting beneath the arbor. His dark suit pressed his tie crooked in the way only a man raised among car engines would manage. He had met Rachel 2 years earlier when her car had broken down outside the auto shop where he worked. They had connected over her stubborn radiator and his off-key humming, and before long their lives tangled into one. Ethan was older steady with the kind of hands that fixed broken things, and Rachel had always been drawn to people like that. Still, Laura had her reservations. Ethan came from money, but not the generous kind. Frank Carter, his father, had made his fortune in land development and had the cold composure of someone used to being the smartest man in the room. He had barely spoken to Laura during planning, opting instead to write large checks and critique the menu. But Rachel had chosen Ethan, and that was enough. Or so Laura hoped. After the vows were exchanged and the applause faded, guests wandered toward the barn where the reception was set. Strings of bulbs hung from the rafters, casting soft light over hay bales and banquet tables. Laura busied herself with greeting friends, serving punch and brushing cake crumbs from the bride's train. But her mind kept drifting. She noticed that Ethan had stepped outside twice, already talking to his younger brother Mason in hushed tones. She watched Frank sip bourbon in the corner, his phone buzzing repeatedly in his jacket pocket. And she couldn't help but notice that Rachel had grown quiet, almost distant as the evening wore on. When Laura finally pulled her aside, Rachel smiled thinly and whispered that she was just tired. Too much adrenaline, too much emotion. She promised they would swing by in the morning before leaving for their honeymoon. A cabin up near Boone, just the 2 of them. Fresh air and no cell service. Rachel had always loved disappearing into the mountains. Laura tried to smile, but something cold bloomed behind her ribs. The Newlyweds left under a shower of dried lavender and birdseed waving from Ethan's restored 1969 red Mustang. Laura stood near the mailbox as the car disappeared down the gravel road, her hand raised long after they were gone. Inside her palm, she still clutched the envelope she had meant to give Rachel an emergency check just in case. But she hadn't wanted to interrupt the moment. She told herself she'd hand it over at breakfast tomorrow. She never got the chance. The following morning, Rachel didn't come by, nor did she call. Laura assumed they had gotten an early start, but by that evening her calls to the cabin went unanswered. No one had checked in. By the third day, Laura drove to Boone herself, only to find the cabin unoccupied and untouched, the bed still made, the reservation untouched. When she reported them missing, the local police filed a basic report. Adults disappear all the time, one deputy had said. Honeymooners change plans. They had no reason to suspect foul play. Weeks passed, then months. The Mustang was never found. No credit card activity, no sightings, no social media presence. Friends assumed that they had run off, eloped, elsewhere started over. But Laura knew her daughter. Rachel wasn't impulsive. She wasn't a runner. Something had gone wrong. She felt it in the marrow of her bones. And yet time is a cruel thief. Without leads, the case went cold. Laura returned to the school library. The flowers died, the photos faded, and the hope, the furious, irrational hope, began to fade too. Until 14 years later, in the summer of 2005, when her phone rang again. And the voice on the other end said they had found something. Something in Pisgah Forest. Something that could change everything. The call came just after 7 on a Tuesday morning in early June. Laura had already been awake sitting at her kitchen table with a cooling cup of tea and an old crossword puzzle she had started but never intended to finish. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but the area code made her pause. It was from Asheville. Her first thought was the library committee perhaps calling about the renovation funds she had submitted for. But when she picked up, the voice on the other end was unfamiliar and professional. The woman identified herself as Detective Serena Wallace from the Buncombe County Sheriff's Office, and though her tone was polite, Laura immediately recognized the cadence of someone choosing their words very carefully. She felt her chest tighten, the old tension coiling in her stomach like a knot that had never quite loosened. Serena asked if she was the mother of Rachel Mitchell, and when Laura confirmed, the line held quiet for a second too long. The detective explained they had received an inquiry from a research team at UNC Asheville who believed they had found something in Pisgah National Forest. A vehicle, possibly submerged, possibly connected to an old missing persons case. By the time Laura arrived at the sheriff's office, her thoughts had ricocheted through every outcome imaginable. She parked her aging Camry in the visitor lot and sat with the engine running for a moment, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned pale. She had not been inside this building since the second year after the disappearance, when she had demanded answers no one could give her. Now, a new detective waited to lead her into a softly lit conference room. Serena Wallace was younger than Laura, expected early 30s maybe, with tightly pulled curls and a notebook filled with color-coded tabs. The detective explained that an environmental studies graduate student named Sasha Reed had been analyzing satellite images from the early 1990s to track the spread of forest coverage and flood damage along river tributaries. During her project, Sasha had found a strange rectangular shadow just beneath the water surface in a section of riverbend rarely visited by hikers. She had cross-checked it with public missing persons records and saw a correlation with Rachel and Ethan's case. She forwarded the image and coordinates to the authorities, who began an aerial verification last week. Serena produced a manila folder from the corner of the table and opened it carefully, revealing a set of printed images. Laura leaned forward as the detective slid one across the table. It showed a grainy, grayscale view of Pisgah Forest, the river curling like a black ribbon through dense trees. In the center, just barely visible, was a pale smudge shaped like a car. Another image was a heat map overlay from sonar scans conducted by the Forest Department's Rescue Division. It confirmed the presence of a vehicle-shaped object beneath roughly 8 feet of silt and water. When Serena flipped to the final page, Laura's breath caught in her throat. It was a photo taken from a drone the day before, showing a rusted corner of red metal poking above the surface where the water line had receded due to recent drought. Though it was nearly unrecognizable, Laura knew. It was Ethan's Mustang. The drive out to the site took nearly 90 minutes, and Laura spent each one staring out the window as pine trees blurred past in green streaks. Serena had offered to ride with her and now sat silently in the passenger seat, respecting the stillness. The trailhead leading to the river access had been cleared by park rangers that morning, with yellow markers fluttering from trees to guide the small forensic team that had gathered. Laura followed the others down a narrow path, branches whipping against her sleeves, her boots crunching against the dry soil. As they reached the clearing by the bend, the water glistened under a sun that seemed too bright for such a grim revelation. Parked beside a utility trailer was a silver recovery truck with cables and pulleys spooling out toward the river. Divers in black suits were crouched near the edge, preparing to begin extraction. Laura stood rooted as the lid technician greeted Serena, then offered her a sympathetic nod. The recovery process was slow, deliberate, and excruciating to witness. The silt had built around the vehicle like cement, and it took hours of coordinated effort to free it from the riverbed. Laura was given a folding chair under a canopy where she waited, watching each muddy piece of metal break the surface. First the back bumper, then a door, then finally the hood with its once shiny Mustang emblem dulled to near obscurity. The car was coated in algae and debris, its windows clouded and shattered from water pressure. As it was pulled onto the trailer and the strap secured, one of the technicians approached the detective and whispered something. Serena turned to Laura, her expression unreadable. They found an object in the back seat. Not skeletal remains. Not clothing or jewelry. It was a violin, or what had once been one. The wood had rotted in places, but the curved silhouette and the curled scroll at the neck were unmistakable. Laura blinked, her heart dropping. Rachel's violin. It had been a gift from Laura's parents when she was 12, and she had carried it everywhere. She played it in high school and college at open mic nights, and sometimes in the quiet of the house when she could not sleep. It was hers. Laura stood on weak legs and moved closer to the evidence table where the violin now rested inside a sealed case. Its strings were warped, the bow broken. But its presence was deafening. It had not been left behind. Rachel had taken it with her. Wherever she went, wherever she ended. A search of the vehicle's interior found no human remains. The front seats had deteriorated, but were mostly intact with no visible blood. The glove compartment contained an old road atlas, its pages stained and bloated from moisture. In the back beneath the violin they recovered a tattered floral scarf and a pack of chewing gum still sealed. Laura stared at the scarf. It was Rachel's. She remembered buying it at a consignment shop on a whim during a mother-daughter lunch trip. That scarf had once wrapped around Rachel's ponytail as she danced in the field behind the barn, spinning in sunlight. And now it had surfaced after 14 years like a hand reaching up from a dream. As they loaded the Mustang onto the transport trailer, Laura stood back and watched the sun shift behind the trees, the light falling in long slanted beams through the canopy. She thought about the conversation she would have to have with Dean, her closest friend who had never stopped checking the missing persons page every few months. She thought about her therapist, about her students who still asked why she never moved away or retired. She thought about Rachel's room, still untouched, still smelling faintly of lilac and old paper. Then she thought about the phone call that had started all this. About the graduate student who had noticed a strange shadow that no one else had ever cared to look for. Sometimes the past only reveals itself when it believes you are ready. And sometimes it does not care if you are. The days following the recovery blurred into a sequence of tightly controlled procedures and sterile documentation. The Mustang was hauled to a secure forensic facility near Asheville for further analysis, while Laura returned to her quiet farmhouse carrying an invisible weight that made her footsteps heavier. She kept the lights off in the living room, preferring the late afternoon sun as her only company. She placed Rachel's violin case on the dining table and sat across from it, unable to open it again. She had already seen what was inside. The warped wood and torn bowstring offered no new answers. Yet, somehow, she felt that the instrument still held a piece of her daughter's voice. Not the literal one that used to call out from the back porch, But the unspoken one, the one she heard whenever Rachel played under the maple tree in the spring, the violin was more than an object. It was memory. It was ritual. And now it was evidence. That word made Laura flinch. Evidence. As if Rachel's entire being had been reduced to a category in a file. As if her daughter was a puzzle to be solved instead of a soul to be mourned. Detective Serena Wallace visited the farm later that week, this time alone and without a notepad. She asked if Laura would mind talking again, this time about Ethan. They sat in the backyard under the same maple tree where Henry Carter had once spoken cryptically about the family. Serena explained that her department was expanding the scope of the investigation. The car's location had raised too many questions to be left as a closed case. If Rachel and Ethan had driven into the river intentionally, the impact would have been visible on the vehicle's frame. But preliminary scans showed no collision damage. No shattered headlights, no buckled doors. Someone had driven the car there with caution and let the current bury it. The implications were clear. Serena wanted to know more about Ethan's relationship with his family, especially his father. Laura hesitated before answering. She had always avoided speculating, not because she lacked suspicions, but because voicing them aloud made them feel like accusations. And the truth was, she had never trusted Frank Carter. Not even on the wedding day. She told Serena about the awkward silences between Frank and Ethan, how Frank had seemed more concerned with appearances than affection. She recalled the wedding speech where Frank had made more references to his own success than to the couple's future. She even mentioned the argument she overheard 2 days before the wedding, where Frank and Ethan stood near the barn, voices low but tense. Laura had not caught the words, but Ethan's shoulders had been rigid, his back to his father, as Frank walked away shaking his head. Serena nodded, scribbling mental notes, but remained expressionless. Then she asked if Laura knew anyone named Otis. The name hit Laura like a pebble dropped into still water. She sat up straighter, her fingers tightening around the mug of tea she had barely touched. "Yes," she said after a long pause. "Otis Reynolds. He was the Carter family's handyman. He was quiet always in the background, fixing fence posts or trimming hedges. Rachel used to say he gave her the creeps, not because he ever said anything wrong, but because he watched people too closely without speaking. He had been at the wedding. He even helped park cars that day." Serena thanked her and left with the assurance that they were pulling property records and witness statements from the time of the disappearance. After she left, Laura wandered back into Rachel's room. The air still smelled faintly of lavender and old wood. Dust had collected on the dresser and bookshelves, but everything else remained exactly as Rachel had left it. The desk calendar still hung on the wall, frozen on June 1991. Laura opened the top drawer where Rachel used to keep her music journals. Among them, tucked beneath a stack of sheet music, she found a small envelope labeled in her daughter's handwriting. It was addressed to no one with no stamp. Inside was a folded note. The ink had faded slightly, but the message was still clear. "I think Ethan is scared. I don't know what his father said to him, but he barely speaks anymore. I'm trying to stay calm, but I don't like how Frank watches us. If anything happens, know that I loved you, that I tried to be strong. I don't want to believe something's wrong, but I feel it." Laura read the note 3 times before she could move again. Her hands trembled as she returned it to the envelope. This was not paranoia. This was not a grieving mother's fantasy. Rachel had felt it too. The shift, the fear. Laura walked outside into the evening air, her breath fogging against the cool twilight. The sun dipped behind the horizon, and the trees stretched their shadows across the lawn like fingers. Somewhere, deep in her chest, the hollow feeling of waiting began to fill with something heavier. Not hope, not quite yet, but purpose. She called Serena's cell and told her about the note. Serena asked her to bring it in the next morning. She also asked Laura a final question before hanging up. Did Rachel ever mention a place she felt safe with Ethan, somewhere they went? Often Laura remembered a spot off a logging road outside Waynesville. They called it Quiet Hollow. It had a small waterfall and a clearing where Rachel said she could think. She gave Serena the directions. That night, Laura dreamed of a forest drenched in fog. In the dream, she walked barefoot along a narrow trail, Rachel's violin in her hands. She could hear water in the distance, not rushing, but steady, like a heartbeat. The trees whispered things she could not understand, but one phrase kept echoing louder than the rest. Follow the silence. When she woke, the dream clung to her like damp clothing. She sat in bed for a long while, thinking about what had really happened in those first days after the wedding. If Ethan and Rachel had made it to Quiet Hollow, then something had changed after. Something deliberate. Someone had wanted to erase them. And someone had come very close to succeeding. Laura stood in the hallway of the Carter estate with her shoulders pulled back and her jaw set. It had been nearly 15 years since she last stepped foot inside the house, and nothing about it felt familiar. The furniture was more expensive now, polished and severe, and the once warm tones of the walls had been replaced with muted grays and sharp lines. The entryway smelled faintly of pine cleaner and cold marble. Eleanor Carter greeted her at the door with a strained politeness that felt like holding a match above a leaking gas line. She wore a black cashmere sweater and silver earrings that looked like heirlooms from a catalog, and her lips moved like someone taught to smile but not to feel it. Laura tried to focus on the reason she had come, reminding herself she was not here to exchange pleasantries. She was here to ask questions no one had wanted to answer. Serena had encouraged her to come directly, believing that a mother's face might draw out something even the badge could not. She doubted it, but she came anyway with Rachel's note in her purse and the weight of years pressing into her spine. They sat in the sunroom where Ethan used to play chess with Mason long before the family's fractures became public knowledge. Eleanor poured 2 cups of chamomile tea and placed one on the table between them. Laura stared at it without touching it. The silence stretched longer than comfort allowed. Finally, Laura asked the question she had rehearsed a dozen times. Did Eleanor know where Otis Reynolds was now? Eleanor blinked once, her hands tightening slightly on the rim of her cup. She said Otis had left not long after the wedding. He had found another job in Georgia and never stayed in touch. She claimed to have no forwarding address or phone number. Her voice was smooth but hollow, like someone telling a bedtime story to a child who was too old to believe in happy endings. Laura pressed further. She asked whether Ethan had ever confided in her about his disagreements with Frank. Eleanor hesitated for the first time. She looked down at her tea and then said something Laura had not expected. Ethan had been planning to leave Asheville after the honeymoon. He was going to take Rachel and start fresh in Oregon. He had not told Frank, but Eleanor had found the airline confirmations in his desk drawer. Laura felt the breath leave her chest. She had always believed that Ethan loved Rachel, but now she had proof that he wanted more than to marry her. He wanted to escape. The idea struck Laura with an ache she could not name. Serena had mentioned they would try to track Otis through employment records and background checks, but until then all they had were fragments. Laura rose to leave, but Eleanor stopped her. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a small velvet pouch. Inside was a ring. Rachel's ring. The one Ethan had placed on her finger during the ceremony. Eleanor said the cleaning staff found it behind a bookshelf in one of the guest rooms months after the wedding. She had kept it, hoping someday it might matter. Laura took it gently, her fingers curling around the cool metal like it was a heartbeat. As she walked back to her car, Laura noticed someone watching her from the upper window. Mason Carter stood behind the glass, his face shadowed by the curtain. He looked older than she remembered, a little heavier with a receding hairline and eyes that darted too quickly. He raised a hand, barely a wave, more like an acknowledgement of presence. Laura nodded once before driving away. She did not trust anyone in that house, but something about Mason's expression stuck with her. He looked like a man who had been holding his breath for too long. That evening, she returned home and placed Rachel's ring beside the violin on the dining table. She stared at them both, trying to understand how 2 objects could speak louder than any testimony. The next morning, Serena called. They had located Otis Reynolds. He was living under a different name in rural Alabama, working odd construction jobs and staying off the radar. He had a record from before he worked for the Carters. Nothing violent, mostly theft and property damage. But something about his sudden departure after the wedding had always felt suspicious. Serena said they were sending an officer to speak with him, but there was no guarantee he would cooperate. Laura felt her stomach twist. She asked if she could go. Serena declined, citing safety, but she promised to keep Laura updated. In the meantime, she advised her to avoid direct contact with the Carter family. Tensions were building and old alliances were starting to fracture. Later that day, Mason showed up at the library where Laura still volunteered twice a week. He did not say hello. He just stood near the stacks until she noticed him. When she walked over, he asked to speak somewhere private. They sat in the quiet room meant for tutoring sessions. Mason leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. He looked exhausted, like someone who had not slept without interruption in years. He told her something had always felt wrong about the day after the wedding. He remembered his father and Otis whispering near the garage. He remembered Ethan's room had been locked and that no one was allowed inside. He said his mother cried that night but never spoke of it again. He admitted he had been afraid to ask questions, afraid to know the answers. But he had kept something. A photograph from the morning of the wedding. It showed Rachel standing beside Ethan near the Mustang, both of them smiling. But in the background, barely visible, Otis stood with his hand on the car's trunk looking straight at the camera. Laura took the photo and held it close. Her pulse throbbed behind her eyes. She thanked Mason and told him to stay safe. As she drove home, she thought about that photograph, about Otis, about the ring, about Eleanor's hesitation. Each piece was a thread, pulling tighter. Somewhere beneath it, all the truth was trying to surface. But truth has a cost, and Laura was starting to realize that not everyone was willing to pay it. Laura sat at her kitchen table with the photograph Mason had given her, studying every detail like it was a map to something buried. The image was faded slightly, the edges curling from time, but it held clarity in the parts that mattered. Rachel's smile was soft and radiant. Her arm looped through Ethan's, their heads tilted just slightly toward one another. They looked like two people who believed the world would step aside and let them begin something beautiful. But Laura's eyes kept drifting to the background, to the sliver of a figure just beyond the Mustang's rear bumper. Otis Reynolds. His posture was straight, hands resting on the trunk as if testing its weight. His expression was difficult to read, caught between blankness and scrutiny. He was watching them. Not as a guest, not as a friend, but as someone who had a different purpose for being there. Laura traced the line of his shoulder with her thumb and felt a chill crawl beneath her skin. The photograph was no longer just an artifact. It was a warning preserved in paper. Later that afternoon, Serena called with an update. She sounded more cautious than usual. Otis Reynolds had been picked up outside a lumber yard near Huntsville. He had been working under the name Curtis Downey and living in a rented trailer at the edge of a gravel lot. He was in custody, not yet charged, but under questioning. Serena said they had not mentioned Rachel or Ethan by name. They wanted to see if Otis would speak freely. So far, he had denied knowing anything about the case, claimed he left North Carolina for unrelated reasons, claimed he barely remembered the wedding, but when they showed him the satellite images of the submerged Mustang, he had gone quiet. No denial, no explanation, just silence. Serena said they needed leverage, something Otis would not expect. She asked if Laura could meet them at the station the following morning. She had an idea. Laura arrived just before 9 the next day, bringing the wedding photograph, Rachel's violin case, and the envelope containing her daughter's handwritten note. Serena met her in the hallway, thanked her, and ushered her into a small observation room with a two-way mirror. On the other side, Otis sat hunched over a metal table, his hands clasped together, his nails bitten down to the quick. He was thinner than Laura, remembered his hair mostly gone, a shadow of beard uneven along his jaw, but his eyes were sharp, alert, like an animal waiting to bolt. Serena joined him in the room and placed the photo in front of him. Otis barely glanced at it. She asked him to tell her about that day, where he had gone after the reception, what he remembered. Otis said he went home early, said he was not close to the family, said he packed up his things and moved the next week. But when Serena laid the violin bow on the table, wrapped in its evidence tag, Otis leaned back slowly and exhaled through his nose. The detective reminded him that the car had not been crashed, that it had been placed, that the road near the riverbank was narrow, difficult to navigate without experience, that someone had known the terrain. Otis remained silent. Then Serena asked if he knew anything about Quiet Hollow, a trail off the edge of a Forestry Service map near Waynesville. Otis blinked. His fingers twitched slightly. Then he said something Laura could barely hear through the audio system. He said he had not gone near that place in years. Serena leaned forward and asked why. He stared at the violin and said because that place is where it ended. She asked what he meant. He paused, then corrected himself. Where it started to end. Serena let the silence stretch. Then she told him something he did not expect. She told him Rachel's mother was watching, that she had brought her daughter's note, that Rachel had known something was wrong. Otis looked at the mirror then, not at Serena, at Laura straight through the glass, and for a second, Laura saw something behind his eyes. Not guilt, not fear, but grief. Later that day, Laura sat across from Serena in her office while the team prepared a transcript of the partial statement. Otis had not confessed to a crime, but he had confirmed one thing. He had followed Rachel and Ethan after the reception. He had not been asked to, not formally, but he had implied there was pressure. He said Frank had told him to keep an eye on the couple, that Ethan was planning to leave, that Rachel was a distraction. Otis said he never meant to hurt anyone, but things got complicated. He claimed Ethan had gotten aggressive when he saw him near the trailhead at Quiet Hollow. Claimed there was an argument. Claimed he tried to drive the car somewhere to get help, but then he stopped talking, and no matter how much Serena pushed, he would not say what happened next. Laura asked if they could arrest him. Serena said not yet. They needed more, but they were closer. That night, Laura went into Rachel's room and opened the notebook her daughter used for song lyrics. Most of the pages were filled with lines and verses about sunlight and roads and the ache of young love. But in the very last page in faint pencil was a sentence that did not sound like a lyric. It said, "The woods are quieter than they should be, and sometimes I think silence has shape." Laura read it again and again until the words blurred into one long string of meaning. Rachel had felt it too. The tension, the watcher, the sense that something or someone had pressed their way into the sacred space she had carved with Ethan. Laura whispered her daughter's name and closed the notebook slowly. She no longer doubted that Otis had been there. But she wondered who else had followed, and why the silence had been allowed to stretch this long without consequence. The next morning, Laura joined Serena and two forensic investigators at the edge of Quiet Hollow. The trailhead was nearly invisible from the gravel access road marked only by a faded metal sign tilted from years of erosion. Tall grass had grown across the footpath and the trees leaned inward like guards protecting a secret. The sun had not yet climbed above the treetops, casting everything in a cool gray hush. Laura walked behind the others, her boots crunching softly against the leaf litter, her thoughts tangled with memory. Rachel had spoken often of this place. It was where she went to breathe, where she brought Ethan on their third date, where she had once carved their initials into a cedar tree. Laura scanned the trunks as they passed, searching for signs of young love in the bark. The initials were there just as Rachel had described, half swallowed by new growth, but still legible. The letters R and E linked by a barely visible heart. Laura traced her fingers over it, then turned to follow the group deeper into the hollow. Serena led the way to a rocky outcrop that overlooked a shallow stream. The air here was cooler, denser, and the sound of running water broke the silence like distant breath. One of the forensic techs used a ground-penetrating radar unit to scan sections of earth where the trail dipped into looser soil. They worked methodically, pacing off distances, logging GPS points, and flagging any anomalies. Laura stayed near the tree line, her hands tucked into her coat sleeves, watching as decades-old roots were brushed aside to reveal damp clay and river pebbles. After nearly an hour, one of the techs called Serena over to a bend in the trail just before it split in two directions. There was something beneath the surface, not large but dense and irregular. Possibly metal, possibly bone. Serena glanced at Laura, then nodded. They began digging with small trowels, careful not to disturb the surrounding area. It took only 15 minutes to unearth what looked like a rusted button and part of a belt buckle. Then came fragments of fabric, a dark blue with a floral pattern Laura recognized immediately. It was Rachel's hiking skirt, the one she wore on long walks when she wanted to feel the wind against her skin. The excavation expanded cautiously. Another button, a small chain bracelet, then a second piece of fabric, this one beige and torn, possibly a shirt collar. Serena kept her voice low but firm, coordinating with the techs as they documented each find. Laura stood motionless as more pieces surfaced. Nothing definitive yet, no bones, no wallets, but each item added weight to the air around them. Then one of the techs held up something different. A photograph. Water-damaged, curled, but still visible. It showed Ethan and Rachel, arms wrapped around each other, standing near a rock formation that matched the one just behind them. Serena took the photo and turned to Laura. It had been buried with care, not scattered. Someone had placed it intentionally. That meant someone had returned here after. Possibly Otis. Possibly someone else. The forest was still. The stream kept flowing. But everything had shifted. Serena suggested they pause and secure the site. More advanced teams would be called in, including anthropologists trained in the shallow burial recovery. Laura followed her back up the trail, her feet unsteady from both the terrain and the rising certainty that they were finally standing where it happened. Not a random accident, not a detour, but a chosen place. A place Ethan had trusted. A place Rachel had loved. A place someone else had defiled. On the drive back, Laura sat in the back seat, her forehead against the cool window. The trees blurred past, green and gold and endless. Her mind turned to Otis, sitting in a holding cell miles away, staring at the same floor he had avoided for over a decade. He had said it was where it started to end. He had meant here. Later that evening, Laura received a voicemail from Mason. His voice was tense, lower than usual, and he spoke in a rush. He said his father was acting strange again. Frank had locked his study door and taken a call that made him shout. Eleanor was worried. Mason said he had gone into the basement after Frank left and found a locked file drawer in an old desk. The key was gone, but he had seen a label, Quiet Hollow. Mason said he was going to try again when the house was empty. Laura called him back immediately, but it went to voicemail. She left a message telling him to be careful to wait for the police. But even as she said it, she knew he would not. At sunrise the next day, Mason met Serena in a small cafe near downtown. He looked pale and jittery, his fingers tapping the coffee cup in erratic rhythms. He said he had gotten the drawer open. Inside were maps, old permits, and photographs. Some of the documents had the family company letterhead. Others were marked with personal notes. One file contained a deed transfer. It listed Otis Reynolds as the buyer of a small parcel of land adjacent to Quiet Hollow, dated 2 weeks after Rachel and Ethan disappeared. The signature at the bottom was Frank Carter's. Mason handed the papers over to Serena, his voice shaking. He said his father always claimed to have sold that land to a friend for tax reasons. But now he saw it differently. It had been hush money, or a reward, or maybe something worse. Serena thanked him and told him to go home and wait. Things were moving fast now. The circle was closing. That night, Laura sat on her porch with a photograph recovered from the hollow spread across her lap. She looked at her daughter's smile, at Ethan's steady hand resting on her shoulder. She thought about the weight of the soil, about the silence that had stretched across years. She thought about Otis and Mason and Frank and all the choices that led them to this point. And then she thought about the sound of Rachel's voice rising through the trees like music that refused to be forgotten. She did not know what the next days would bring, but she knew the forest had begun to speak. The morning after Mason turned over the land deeds, Serena returned to the Carter estate with a search warrant in hand. She was accompanied by 2 officers from the sheriff's department and a forensic technician. They arrived just after 9 when the light was soft and low through the oaks, casting long shadows across the front steps. Eleanor answered the door with tight composure. Her mouth formed a practiced smile, but her eyes gave her away. She asked what this was about, and Serena explained calmly that they were there to search Frank's study and office for any material related to the land transfer and the disappearance of Rachel and Ethan. Eleanor nodded without protest and stepped aside. She looked smaller. Somehow her stature diminished not by age, but by weight she could no longer carry alone. Frank was not home. He had left early that morning, according to Eleanor, claiming to have a meeting in Raleigh. His absence was convenient, but not suspicious in itself. Serena believed he would return soon, likely confident nothing could touch him. They entered the study and began photographing the room before touching anything. It was a dark, wood-paneled chamber with a large mahogany desk, built-in bookshelves, and 2 locked filing cabinets near the back wall. The scent of pipe tobacco lingered in the corners like old smoke clinging to time. Serena moved methodically, instructing the technician to begin with the desk drawers. Inside the top one they found receipts, travel itineraries, and a copy of a wedding guest list. But the bottom drawer was what they had come for. The technician picked the lock in under a minute. Inside was a thick leather folder bound with a strap. Serena opened it slowly, revealing photographs clipped to property maps, emails printed on corporate letterhead, and a handwritten ledger detailing cash withdrawals. Each item was labeled by year. The entries began in late 1990 and ended abruptly in July 1991. Several pages referenced Otis Reynolds by name, noting payments made through various subcontractor accounts. One page simply read Quiet Hollow Coordination and was followed by 2 large numbers and a notation beside them. Final cleanup 615. Serena handed the documents to her colleague for cataloging and then turned her attention to the second cabinet. It contained estate planning documents and legal correspondence. Buried beneath these was a single manila envelope marked Private in large handwriting. Inside were 2 photographs that had never been submitted into evidence. Both showed the red Mustang, one parked at the edge of a trail and another halfway submerged in a shallow bend of river, the same spot where it had been recovered. The fact that Frank had these photos before the vehicle was discovered in 2005 confirmed something more chilling. He had known where it was the entire time. He had chosen to let it disappear. Serena stepped back and let the room settle around her. This was more than obstruction. This was concealment. This was orchestration. The officers bagged the evidence and informed Eleanor they would return later that day to formally interview her. She said nothing, just nodded and sat quietly in the foyer as they left. Her hands folded neatly in her lap, but her eyes stayed fixed on the front door. Later that afternoon, Laura was called to the sheriff's department to review the new findings. She sat across from Serena in a small conference room as the detective laid out each piece one by one. The property maps, the financial ledger, the emails, the photographs. Laura did not speak for several minutes. She studied each paper with the steady patience of someone who had waited too long for answers, and now found herself drowning in them. Serena asked if she wanted to be in the room when they questioned Frank. Laura said no. She had already heard everything she needed to hear from that man. She only wanted to see Rachel's name cleared, to see the full truth written down not just for her, but for anyone who had ever doubted what kind of girl her daughter had been. Meanwhile, Mason called Serena with news. Frank had returned home and was in his study again. He seemed agitated but not panicked. Mason said his father had made 2 phone calls to a lawyer and one to a private number in South Carolina. Serena thanked him and told him to stay clear. Then she made arrangements for a formal arrest. They could not risk Frank leaving the state. just before 6 officers returned to the Carter property and placed Frank under arrest without incident. He did not resist. He did not argue. He merely asked for a coat and followed them to the cruiser. His silence was not dignified. It was mechanical, as if he had already resigned himself to the story being over. Inside the interrogation room, Frank refused to answer most questions. He claimed no memory of the Mustang photographs. He said the payments to Otis were for unrelated work. He denied knowing anything about a burial site, but when Serena placed the map in front of him with the handwritten date 615 and the words "Final Cleanup," something flickered behind his eyes. It was not surprise, it was calculation. He leaned back and said quietly that he had never touched those kids, that if something happened out there, it was not on him. When asked who had orchestrated it, he gave no name. When asked if Otis had been acting under orders, he leaned forward and asked for his lawyer. As they processed the formal charges, Laura returned home and sat once again at Rachel's desk. She opened the bottom drawer and took out a bundle of letters tied with twine. They were from Ethan, written during their engagement. She had never read them before. She had respected Rachel's privacy, but now she felt the time had come. She untied the bundle and unfolded the first page. The handwriting was steady masculine, filled with words about hope and fear and building a future that no one could take from them. Ethan had written about wanting to build a home somewhere far from Asheville, a place where Rachel could teach music and he could open a garage, a place where no one cared about names or legacies or old family money. Laura felt tears rise and fall quietly, not because she was sad, but because the letters told her something she had never been fully sure of. Rachel had not been taken from someone. She had been chosen, loved, and that mattered more than any confession ever could. 2 days after Frank Carter's arrest, the forensic team returned to Quiet Hollow with heavier equipment and a full excavation permit. The shallow gravesite identified earlier had yielded only surface artifacts, but their work was far from complete. A deeper scan using specialized ground radar had revealed a second anomaly about 6 feet from the original dig located beneath a flat stone that had once been part of the natural trail. The crew set up early in the morning before the heat could settle into the soil. Serena arrived with her field notes while Laura stood back from the flagged perimeter, her arms crossed and her eyes fixed on the small hollow where her daughter had once walked without fear. She did not speak as the crew began digging. She did not need to. Every scrape of the shovel through clay carried the weight of the answers she had carried alone for years. By late morning, the team had cleared a layer of compacted soil and exposed what appeared to be remnants of canvas or tightly woven fabric. One of the technicians knelt and brushed away the sediment with a soft tool, revealing more of the material beneath. It was not a tent or tarp. It was clothing, folded in a way that suggested careful placement, not carelessness. Just beneath that, the first signs of skeletal remains began to emerge. A forearm, a partial rib cage, the curve of a hip. Serena stepped forward and called for the anthropologist assigned to the case. Laura stood motionless, her body stiff but her face unreadable. The technician worked slowly, preserving every angle, every measurement. They continued for another hour, and then found what no one had said aloud but everyone had expected. A second set of remains, smaller in build, positioned beside the first. The bones were close together, closer than chance. The evidence suggested they had been placed intentionally side by side with Ethan's arm resting just above Rachel's shoulder. It took hours to finish the recovery. Each bone was photographed, mapped, and gently removed from the ground. The remains were bagged and labeled separately. The personal items found with them were cataloged in silence. Ethan's watch, Rachel's locket, a rusted ring that still held the impression of an engraved date. June 8, 1991. The forensic pathologist said it would take time to confirm identities, but no one needed confirmation. Laura knew. Serena knew. Even the birds had gone quiet in the trees. When the last of the evidence was sealed and placed in the transport van, Serena turned to Laura and said nothing. She did not need to. Laura nodded once and turned back toward the trail. She walked alone this time, letting each step echo in the hollow that had once promised peace. Back at the sheriff's department, Otis Reynolds sat in the interview room with his hands folded on the table. He had been briefed about the discovery. He had not spoken since. Not during lunch, not during processing, not even when informed of the potential murder charges that now loomed over him. But that afternoon, when Serena stepped into the room with the photo recovered from the grave, he finally broke the silence. He said it was never supposed to happen like that. He said they were just supposed to scare them, keep them in town, make them rethink everything. He said Frank had promised it would be clean. No violence. Just a confrontation, a lesson. But something went wrong. Otis said Ethan recognized him when he followed them, that Ethan charged at him near the stream, that in the scuffle, Rachel had screamed and Otis panicked. He claimed he never meant to hurt her, that he had only shoved Ethan back, that Ethan hit his head, that Rachel slipped on the rocks, that it all happened too fast. Then he paused. Then he said he buried them because he could not face what came next. Serena asked why he stayed silent for 14 years. Otis looked at the table and said because Frank paid him to disappear. Because Frank said if anyone asked questions he would say Otis acted alone, that no one would believe otherwise, that he would ruin him before the law ever could. Serena asked if he believed that was true. Otis said at the time he did, and then eventually he just got used to it, to waking up with it, to living with it, to carrying it like rust inside his bones. He said he had never stopped seeing Rachel's face in the mirror, that he sometimes still heard her voice when he passed a violinist in the street. He agreed to a full confession in writing and signed his statement before being led back to his cell. When the door closed behind him, he sat on the edge of the cot and stared at the wall like he was waiting for something that would not come. That night, Serena delivered the news to Laura personally. She met her on the porch of the farmhouse, the sky behind her fading into a bruised blue. Laura listened without interrupting as Serena described the confession. The scuffle, the panic, the burial. She nodded once, then asked if Otis had said anything about Rachel's last words. Serena hesitated. She said Otis had not mentioned any words. Only the scream. Only the silence that came after. Laura accepted this quietly. Then she walked back inside and returned with the small bundle of letters she had read earlier. She handed them to Serena and asked if she could place them with the evidence. Serena said she would try, that she would ask the district attorney. Laura said it did not matter where they were stored, only that they were part of the truth now, part of the record, part of what remained. At the memorial service held 2 weeks later, people came from across the county, former students of Rachel's, friends who had never stopped hoping. Even Mason and Eleanor, who stood quietly in the back each with their hands folded in front of them. The service was held in the same pasture where Rachel and Ethan had been married. The arbor was long gone, but the tree line remained, and the wind moved through it like breath. Laura stood at the front holding Rachel's violin, now cleaned and repaired, though unplayable. She spoke simply. She said that some stories do not end in revelations, that some truths come slowly, that some silences are not empty but full. She said Rachel and Ethan had been in love, that they had wanted a life, not a legacy, that the world had failed them, but she would not now, not ever. The days following the memorial unfolded with an unnatural quiet that Laura had not expected. The grief she had prepared for never quite arrived in the way she imagined. Instead, there was a strange stillness in her home, not hollow like before, but full of something unspoken. Rachel had been found. Ethan had been found. The story that had once swallowed her whole had finally released its grip, but in the space where it had lived, something else now grew. She found herself lingering in the living room longer than usual, standing by the mantel, where a framed photo of Rachel rested beside a small vase of wildflowers. She rearranged it every morning out of habit. Some days she whispered to it, other days she could only manage a nod. The violin sat beside the photo, its case open, the bow laid across its hollow body like a final breath. She had once hoped to hear it again, even just once, But now she knew the silence it held was its own kind of music. A music she could live with. At the sheriff's office, the final charges were being processed. Otis Reynolds faced multiple counts, including 2 charges of involuntary manslaughter and obstruction of justice. The district attorney's office had decided against first-degree murder, citing lack of intent and the plausibility of his version of events. Frank Carter, however, was facing far graver consequences. In addition to obstruction, he was charged with a conspiracy to commit a felony, tampering with evidence and witness intimidation. His financial records revealed a network of silent payments to individuals beyond Otis, including a private investigator and a former deputy who had suppressed parts of the missing persons file in 1991. His influence had reached deeper than expected, and while some of his actions could not be directly tied to the deaths, the weight of his manipulation was undeniable. The trial was scheduled for the fall. A courtroom had been reserved. Witnesses were being prepared. Serena would testify. Mason had agreed to take the stand. Laura had not yet decided. Eleanor Carter had not been charged. She had cooperated, fully surrendered financial records, turned over communications, and provided statements that corroborated Mason's findings. It became clear that she had been kept in the dark about much of her husband's dealings. Whether by choice or by design was harder to say. Laura saw her once more before the hearing at the cemetery where Ethan and Rachel were finally laid to rest. It was a brief encounter. Eleanor approached, slowly clutching a single white lily in her hand. She placed it on the headstone and said nothing at first. Laura stood beside her, arms crossed, shoulders square. When Eleanor finally spoke, her voice was almost too soft to hear. She said she was sorry, not for what had happened, but for not asking more questions. Laura nodded once and said that silence is a choice too. They stood like that for a few minutes, 2 women linked by love and loss, then parted without another word. Mason visited Laura a few days later. He brought a cardboard box filled with personal items that had belonged to Ethan. Some of it was trivial. A pair of old sunglasses, a favorite mug, an oil-stained baseball cap. But at the bottom of the box was a journal. Laura opened it and found entries written in Ethan's blocky handwriting. Most of the pages detailed car parts, design sketches, plans for a custom garage. But scattered among them were notes about Rachel, observations, memories. One entry described the sound of her laughter when she read poetry aloud. Another described the way she tapped her foot when she listened to live music, even when she'd pretended not to care. The last entry was dated 2 days before the wedding. It said he had never believed in fate until he met her. That loving her felt like knowing the right answer before the question was even asked. Laura closed the journal and held it to her chest. She did not cry. She had done enough of that. She just breathed in the weight of it. In the weeks leading up to the trial, Serena continued building the case with a kind of steady focus that Laura both admired and feared. There was a resolve in the way she moved through the evidence, like she had made a promise to the past that she would not let it vanish again. One evening, Serena stopped by the farm unannounced. She brought with her a digital recorder and a stack of printed transcripts. She explained that the prosecution wanted to use portions of Rachel's letter and Ethan's journal in their closing statements, not because they were evidence in the traditional sense, but because they painted a portrait of who the victims were. People, not just names. Lives, not just timelines. She asked Laura if she was comfortable with that. Laura said yes. If Rachel could no longer speak for herself, then at least her words could. That night, after Serena left, Laura sat on the porch with the journal in her lap. The air smelled like cut grass and early rain. A breeze tugged at the edge of her blanket as she flipped through the pages again. Near the center of the journal was a folded napkin. It had a lipstick print in the corner and a few scribbled words. "Meet me where the light breaks through the trees." It was Rachel's handwriting. Laura smiled faintly. She knew exactly where that was. She had seen it in Rachel's eyes every time she spoke about Quiet Hollow. The light there had always been different, softer somehow, filtered through memory and moss. She closed the journal and watched the moon rise over the trees. Somewhere behind that light was the girl she had raised, and the boy who had chosen her. The courtroom was quiet when Laura entered, the kind of stillness that comes before a storm or after a long silence that has lasted too many years. She stepped inside with slow movements, her coat folded over one arm, a folder clutched in her hand containing copies of Rachel's note and Ethan's journal entries. It was early morning, and the public benches had not yet filled. The press had been kept at a respectful distance by court order, though their vans still lined the street like silent witnesses. Laura took a seat near the front behind the prosecution's table, where Serena sat reviewing notes with the assistant district attorney. Mason was already seated a few rows behind her, his tie slightly crooked, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. When he met Laura's eyes, he gave her a small nod. She returned it, then looked ahead toward the bench where the judge would soon appear, and the man who had tried to silence her daughter's story would be made to listen to it in full. Frank Carter was brought in wearing a navy suit and a blank expression. His posture was stiff, his gaze focused somewhere beyond the wall, not on the people in the room. His lawyers flanked him, murmuring quietly, one tapping a pen against a notepad with rhythmic insistence. He did not acknowledge Eleanor when she entered moments later, nor did he look toward Mason. He kept his eyes on nothing, as if he could will the truth away by refusing to face it. Eleanor sat near the back, her face pale, her shoulders drawn inward like a child waiting for punishment. She wore the same silver earrings she had worn at Rachel and Ethan's wedding, though Laura doubted she realized it. Memory clings to objects in ways the mind cannot always explain. The judge entered with little ceremony, a man in his 60s with tired eyes and a voice that carried both authority and patience. He called the room to order and the trial began. The prosecution laid out their case with precision. They presented the financial records linking Frank to Otis. They showed the photographs of the Mustang before it was recovered. They detailed the sequence of events that had led to the burial site at Quiet Hollow. Each fact was delivered not with drama, but with weight. Every piece of evidence was a stone in a wall that could no longer be denied. Serena testified, calmly recounting the discovery of the vehicle, the artifacts, the remains. Her voice never wavered, not even when describing the items found with the bodies. The violin, the locket. The note Rachel had written to her mother, Otis, testified next, brought in from the detention facility under heavy guard. His appearance had changed. He looked older now, not just in years, but in posture. He spoke softly, answering questions with the same flat honesty that had marked his confession. He did not try to justify his actions. He admitted his fear, his complicity, his silence. He described the night at Quiet Hollow with clarity that made the room colder. He told them about the confrontation, the panic, the moment everything unraveled. When asked if Frank Carter had explicitly ordered harm, Otis hesitated, then said no. But when asked if Frank had created the conditions for that harm, he said yes. He said Frank had spoken of Rachel as a problem, as a mistake, as something to be corrected. He said those words had given him permission to act. Not by command, but by implication, Mason took the stand on the third day. His voice was quiet, uncertain at first, but it grew steadier as he recounted the events that had led him to discover the hidden documents. He described his father's temper, his control, the way he made silence feel like safety. He spoke of the drawer in the basement, the maps, the payments. He said he had never known for sure what had happened to Ethan until that summer. But he had always suspected something was wrong, something rotten at the root of their family tree. When asked why he chose to speak up now, he looked directly at Laura and said, "Because someone had to." The defense tried to paint a different picture. They argued that Frank had been trying to protect his son from a rushed marriage, that he had hired Otis only to monitor, not to intimidate, that he had never intended for anyone to be harmed. But the weight of the evidence, the precision of the testimony, and the quiet conviction of the witnesses made those arguments feel hollow. When the prosecution rested, the courtroom fell into a deep silence. The judge recessed for the day, and everyone filed out slowly, like leaving a place of worship where something sacred had been acknowledged at last. That evening, Laura drove out to Quiet Hollow alone. The air was still, and the light filtered through the trees in long ribbons of golden shadow. She followed the trail with practiced steps, her boots brushing softly against the moss and roots. When she reached the clearing, she paused. The place where Rachel and Ethan had been found was now marked with 2 flat stones set side by side. No names, no dates, just smooth surfaces beneath the pines. She knelt beside them and placed a small bouquet of wildflowers between the markers. She had picked them from the edge of her own pasture that morning. She sat on the earth and whispered aloud the words she had saved for too long. She told Rachel she was sorry for not seeing sooner, for not asking harder questions. She told Ethan thank you for loving her daughter with his whole heart, for choosing her over the easy path, for trying to build a life with her even when the odds were against them. When she returned to the car, she found a small envelope tucked beneath the windshield wiper. It had no name, only her address written in careful script. Inside was a note from Eleanor. It said she had found something among Frank's papers that Laura might want. It was a cassette tape labeled simply Rachel. Eleanor wrote that it had been sealed in a box marked for destruction, but she had opened it at the last moment. She was leaving it to Laura because it no longer belonged to anyone else. Laura played the tape later that night. The audio was soft crackling with static, but clear enough to recognize the voice. Rachel was singing. Just her voice and a piano. A song Laura had never heard before. Something original, something gentle. The lyrics spoke of light and trees and finding peace in the quiet, of leaving a message where no one could erase it. Laura sat in the dark and listened to the entire recording with her eyes closed. When it ended, she pressed rewind and played it again. Not because she needed more answers, but because for the first time in a long while she simply wanted to hear her daughter's voice. The trial ended with a conviction. Frank Carter was sentenced to 20 years for his role in the cover-up and conspiracy. Otis received a reduced sentence with the possibility of parole after 10. Mason returned home with a sense of quiet resolution. Serena transferred to a federal unit in Charlotte but called Laura once before she left. She thanked her for her strength. Laura said it was not strength, it was memory. Years later, the pasture where Rachel and Ethan were married became a public garden. No plaques, no statues, just space, just flowers, just music drifting sometimes on the breeze from a nearby school where Laura helped fund a music room in her daughter's name. She visited often, not out of grief, but out of gratitude. Because some stories do not vanish, some names do not fade, some love does not end. If this story moved you, consider liking and subscribing to support more powerful narratives like this. Let us know in the comments what part stayed with you most and where in the world you're watching from. Your voice matters here.